Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the newest program in the Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange. Climate change, past, present, and future, perspectives on time and how we respond to our changing environment. My name is Amy Longsworth. Along with my colleague, John Cleveland, we're the staff of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. The GRCx, Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange, is a virtual interactive program series designed to support the Green Ribbon Commission's mission of accelerating the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. Our program today is looking at the following question. Even though climate scientists are clear and consistent that burning fossil fuels releases greenhouse gases that warm our atmosphere and cause grave harm, people seem to have difficulty responding rationally to that information. Why is that? Research from the field of psychology suggests that humans have evolved cognitive biases to focus on immediate threats and ignore slow changes over time. Other communities of research and practice think differently about why we struggle to comprehend large-scale changes. The experiences of Indigenous people and their historical wisdom suggests that culture, or even more basic concepts about our place in the world, can also shape how we process information about large-scale environmental transformations like climate change and our impact and how it impacts our relationship to it as an external problem. So this GRCx will feature 3 expert perspectives on how their perception of climate change have been shaped and why it is an urgent threat. The panelists will explore both Western and Native people perceptions of time, how we value and approach our relationship to land, how our brains do or don't process large-scale phenomena and long time spans, and how climate change has shaped Boston itself over the last 10,000 years. So this is a very long-term look at a very immediate problem. Next slide, please. Today's program was developed in collaboration with the GRC's Cultural Institutions Working Group and their collective climate programming initiative, Action Pact Boston. Action Pact Boston, and in fact, the working group itself, is a consortium of some 40 arts, science, history, sports, parks and zoos, entertainment organizations committed to protecting Boston from climate change. It's also a website, actionpactboston, all one word, .com, and you can find all kinds of cultural climate programming that's going on right now in Boston under events. Next slide. So before I introduce our panelists, and I have to just say I'm super excited and super grateful to these panelists, and this is a topic I have long wanted to do a GRCx program on because it's a really, it's a head scratcher to me in a way. Why aren't we all out, performing civil disobedience in the streets every day about this, about the impending disaster that's about to befall us? Before I introduce our panelists, a few logistical notes. One, we are recording this session. After we're done today, you will get an email with a link to the recording and the slides. And also there's a feedback survey if you would be kind enough to fill that out. It helps us. If you have questions for the panelists, please put them into the chat box and I will draw from the chat box to feed questions to them. And then finally, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Our format's going to be about 15 minutes for each speaker to present, followed by a general discussion among the 3 of them. This group, there's a slight departure for us in the format, but this group of speakers has so much to say to each other. I thought I should just get out of the way for a while. And then around noon, we'll start taking Q&A from the audience. So again, questions in the chat. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome these 3 strong partners in our work, great professionals in their fields. First up, Joe Bagley is the city archaeologist and director of archaeology for the city of Boston. He specializes in historic and ancient archaeology of New England, stone tool analysis, historic ceramics, urban archaeology, and community archaeology. He has published 2 award-winning books, A History of Boston in 50 Artifacts, and Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them, which I have bought and highly recommend. Originally from Maine, Joe has surveyed archaeological sites throughout New England, and today he lives in the Lower Mills area of Boston. I'm sorry, throughout New England and Florida. I hope you bring that into your talk, Joe. Our second speaker is Elizabeth Solomon, an enrolled member and officer of the Massachusett tribe at Ponkapog. Ms. Solomon speaks frequently about local Indigenous issues and has a longstanding commitment to human rights, diversity, inclusion, and community building that she brings to both her paid and volunteer work. She works as the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and has 3 decades of public health experience working in both university and community-based settings. She's also advising the Boston Harbor Islands National Park, the Stone Living Lab, the Massachusetts Commonwealth Flag and Seal Commission, and recently completed a master's degree in museum studies at the Harvard Extension School, and really is working with Native communities and others that are currently underrepresented in museum exhibits and public history programs to assist them with bringing their voices and stories to the forefront. And our third speaker, Conor Slide, is a political psychologist and a senior strategic advisor for the peace-building foundations One Earth and Pax Sapiens. At both organizations, his work focuses on questions of how to set up systems that work with what we know about human psychology to reinforce long-term sustainable solutions to complex problems. He is a lead author on a chapter in the forthcoming United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction's 2022 Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm sure there's a shorthand for that, about human biases and how governments can improve long-term thinking for disaster response. He's worked in the past with a number of NGOs on evidence-based practice for social impact, including positions with Psychology Beyond Borders and others. He holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. So we're going to begin with Joe, followed by Elizabeth, followed by Conor, some discussion among the 3 of them, and then questions from you. And Joe, I'm going to turn this over to you right now.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be essentially laying the foundations of the storyline that we're going to be discussing here in Boston Harbor. So I like to start a lot of these discussions with a timeline to kind of place ourselves into relevance of the historic timeline of Boston. So most people think of the history of Boston as starting in 1630. The reality is the true history of Boston, the human history of Boston goes back thousands and thousands of years, at least 12,000 years that we know of at the arrival of people to the region. And the reality is, if you had a timeline that's 100 feet long, the last 3 feet of that timeline would be the events from 1630 to today. So the vast, vast majority of the history of Boston is the story of the Massachusett people who hold Boston. Next slide, please. So we're going to start at the glacial period and work our way forward, going through the different time periods, talking about the changes of the ecology and the landscape of Boston, specifically Boston Harbor, but also talking about some of the cultural changes that we see recorded in archaeological sites. And I want to emphasize one important part of this is that this is the archaeological story. It's an incomplete story. It's an inherently incomplete story based on the creations made by Massachusetts people here in Boston over time, to which needs to be added the oral history that Elizabeth will be covering as well. So this is the one perspective of this storyline. So 20,000 years ago was during the glacial maximum of the Laurentide ice sheet, which you can see on the image, that covered all of Canada and the vast majority of the northern parts of the United States. You've probably heard before that Boston was covered under a mile of ice. And the edge of that ice sheet was just south of where we are today in Boston, along Long Island, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. Next slide, please. The ice that was present had a very liquid there was a lot of liquid and mud underneath it that got trapped, moved, and squeezed around by the weight and the pressure of the glacier as it moved across the landscape. And what it did is it formed these geologic landforms that we call drumlins. And essentially they're mud, rocks, and clay that got squished into these elongated hills that have one steep side and a much shallower slope on the opposite side. And they point in the direction of the ice sheet as it moved away, stretching out these hills on the landscape. Boston has a really unique set of drumlins. The vast majority of the hills in Boston and the Harbor Islands are drumlins made by the glacier 20,000+ years ago. But Boston Harbor is a unique in the United States geologic formation called a drowned drumlin field. What that means is that as the glacier peeled back, it left behind this drumlin field, like you can see in this photo from Wisconsin, that over time drowned by rising seas. And those drowned drumlins formed the Boston Harbor Islands. Next slide, please. So these have been moved around quite a bit by the actions of the ocean over the past 12,000 years, but each of these islands essentially represent the stretched and elongated drumlins, plus the soils that have been moved around them by the movements of the ocean and the glacial outwash from the ocean over time. But essentially that's the origin story of the actual land that we call the Harbor Islands. But the land form around the Harbor Islands has undergone extreme changes over time. Next slide, please. We've broken down archaeologically the timeline that predates 1630, going back to at least 12,000 years, into three main time periods called the Paleo-Indian period, the Archaic period, and the Woodland period. So what I'm going to do is we're going to march through time as a bit of a culture history over that 12,000 years to talk about some of the changes that happened during these three main periods. And we can go into much more detail as to what happens in all the sub periods, but we want to kind of cover a lot of ground today. We have the entire native history of Boston up until today to include in this brief presentation. But you can see that the Paleo-Indian period is a fairly short time period. The Archaic period is a much longer time period. And the Woodland period is about a 3,000-year period that essentially ends at the arrival of Europeans in 1630. Next slide, please. I wanted to compare that also with this chart of sea level change that occurred in the North Atlantic during the same time period that the Massachusett people are here in Boston. And I've broken up the timeline into these time periods that we've looked at in the timeline breakdown to show the rapid increase of the sea level at the early Paleo-Indian period and the early Archaic period, and a relative stabilization that happens during the Middle Archaic, the Late Archaic, and the Woodland, even though that's still representing about 10 meters of sea level rise that happened over the past 6,000 years. I have some visual representation as to how this translates to the landscape of Boston Harbor. Next slide, please. So 14,000 years ago, when the vast majority of the ocean water that was trapped in the glacier was still trapped and essentially starting to melt, the sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, approximately 100 meters below where they are today. And what that means from a landscape perspective is that the east coast of the United States and eastern Canada really was a dramatically different place. So the white land that you can see in this map of the Maritimes, including Boston on the lower left, all of the white areas of the land that's now underwater would essentially have been above sea level, meaning you could have walked out there. And this is why trawlers and fishing vessels off the coast of Maine and Massachusetts, including the Georges Bank just due east of Boston, this is why people can actually find mastodon teeth during fishing in these areas, because these are land that would have been occupiable that has since been drowned by the rising seas. Next slide, please. So this is you're going to see this slide throughout the rest of the presentation from me, kind of transforming the the landscape of the harbor into different time periods to represent kind of the changes of the harbor islands over time. You can see just through the faint white overlay that I did above the word "the" in the past and future of Boston. That's downtown Boston, where City Hall is, and that's going to be our reference point for the future slides. That kind of northwest corner is downtown. Next slide, please. So 20,000 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot to see. We were again under that 12,000, that mile thick layer of ice, but then right soon after, the ice had pulled back and we had the opportunity for people to be able to live in and use the space, but we would refer to the Paleo-Indians at that time period. Next slide, please. So what's happening culturally here in this area? From an ecological point of view, the glacier took away most of the soil. So there really wasn't any trees. The soil has to develop over time. So we had a really tundra-like environment, both from the temperature of the land and the air, and the lack of overall plants. There was a lot of what we call megafauna, the large animals, many of which are extinct now, things like mastodon and caribou living in the area. You have to think of a northern Canada, northern Alaska type landscape at this time period. From an archaeological point of view, what we see is what's called a fluted point. It's a very large spear point with a large flake taken up the side of it. And these are the calling card of this Paleo-Indian period of between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And you can, the photo that I'm using on the upper left comes from the Peabody Museum up in Andover. And this is an artifact that was found in Canton, Massachusetts at one of the nearest Paleo-Indian sites to Boston. We've yet to find a Paleo-Indian site in Boston, mostly because we have so much of the land lost to rising seas. But there are many sites from the Paleo-Indian period surrounding the city. Next slide, please. So back to our landscape evolution. We're going to go to the next slide. So by 9,000 years ago, we have the formation of the larger river systems in Boston. You can see on the far left is the Charles River, the lower part of the image. There's 3 rivers visible. The one on the left is the Neponset River. The one on the right is actually an extinct river that doesn't exist anymore. It's essentially the, I call it the Paleo-Massachusett River, or the ancient river that used to be in Massachusett, which is now Weymouth. But you can see that these three rivers came together and then flowed east, and you could walk on dry land from downtown Boston in the upper left corner all the way out to the outer harbor islands 9,000 years ago in this kind of large riverina system with marshes and islands. Next slide, please. So during the Archaic period, which is a very long period from 10,000 to 3,000 years, lots happening. But essentially, we still have an overall hunter-gatherer type of food gathering where we're not, the native people are not growing plants yet, but they're making soapstone bowls carved out of soapstone, which can be found in central part of Massachusetts. There's large use of groundstone tools, which are carved out of from rock instead of an apt. The use of spears, darts, and addles, and you can see an addle throwing stick used by the National Park Service member on the upper image. And a real focus on the riverine environments and fish spears. We have the ancient fish spears here in Boston that are at least 3,000 to 5,000 years old from the Archaic period. Those were fishing structures that were used along the harbor during this time period. Next slide, please. So from 9,000 years, we see a pretty rapid change in the landscape. Next slide, please. So 6,000 years ago, we really have the arrival of the ocean to kind of the front door of Boston Harbor. The outer harbor islands can be just starting to form off the east coast of Boston Harbor. The rivers are still very much present. The Massachusett hasn't been drowned yet. And it's at this point that we see a rapid change in Boston Harbor. Next slide, please. So you can imagine Boston Harbor is sitting like a plate next to the edge of the ocean. It takes a long time for the water to get up to the edge of that plate, but as soon as it gets over the rim of that plate, it floods pretty quickly. The harbor is it's a deep harbor, but it's a fairly flat harbor. So when the water enters into the harbor, it floods fairly rapidly and extensively across the space. So by 3,000 years, we really have the formation of the early versions of the harbor islands, especially the middle and the outer islands. We haven't quite yet separated Thompson's Island from the mainland, but at this point, we really have a transition of the harbor or really the creation of the harbor from the natural rises of the sea from the melting glacier. Next slide, please. And then we get all the way up to 1630 at some of the arrivals of Europeans. And at that point, we have the formation of the Boston Harbor, the peninsula that we now call Boston on the upper left and the northwest corner of this image. And this is what the early colonists experienced in Boston. And you can see how the harbor really is a fairly recent addition to the storyline of Boston as a whole. Next slide. During that woodland period from about 3,000 to 400 years, we have some pretty significant changes that happen. The development of agriculture in the region with the growth of Three Sisters gardens, the corn, bean, and squash gardens. We have the formation of stable villages. Some of them are fortified, although some of those were likely fortified because of the arrival of Europeans that happened toward the end of this period. We have the use of pottery for the first time. Pottery was not seen in the region before after 3,000 years ago. It's really from the past 3,000 years. And the invention and use of the true bow and arrow. So the formation of arrowheads, for example, didn't happen until only the past couple of thousand years. And this was the cultural reality that was being encroached upon, colonized, and eradicated by the Europeans that arrived beginning in the early 1600s. Next slide, please. Also at this time, because there's a relative stabilization that's occurring out in the harbor of the sea level rise and the overall climate, we have the formation of clamshell beds. So up until this time, there have been clams and oysters living in the ocean all throughout the world, really. But it's not until the past 3,000 years that the ocean levels are moving at a slow enough pace that the clams could become established and the oysters can become established at large enough numbers that people can rely on them as a source of food. So it's not until about 3,000 years ago that we get the development of what's called a shell midden, which are areas where native people have collected thousands of clam shells, brought them to the land, eaten the clams, left the clams on the shoreline, and these pile up over time and forming these dense cultural deposits that archaeologists refer to as shell middens. It's a combination of shell and the organic matter left behind by decaying foodstuffs. It forms this black deposit. This photo I took is actually of a shell midden down at Martha's Vineyard. It's very likely, since this photo is almost 15 years old now, that everything you see in this photo has since been lost due to erosion caused by climate change. And it was eroding the day I was taking the picture of it. But you can see that these are very visually obvious cultural deposits by native people going back thousands, if not hundreds, if not thousands of years. Next slide, please. So starting to look forward as we transition to some of the other speakers, I wanted to do the following slide from 1630 to the present day. Can we go to the next slide? To show just how much of the land we have now filled back in, creating these really low-lying areas that are extremely susceptible to sea level rise and storm surges due to the relative height above sea level is pretty low. And if we can go to the next slide, the predictions of kind of the worst case scenario in the future in 2100 during a storm surge shows that we could be actually restoring much of Boston to its original 1630s shoreline. But that also shows a pretty clear indication of some of the more vulnerable areas of Boston and surrounding communities because of sea level change caused by people during leading to climate change. Next slide, please. So while this isn't just meant to show kind of the culture history of the region and the evolution of the ecology of this region, what I also wanted to talk about at the very end is that that erosion and that sea level rise that's occurring today, yesterday, in the past decades, that has really threatened the cultural resources on the harbor islands, including both the native archaeological sites and the historic archaeological sites. It's difficult to photograph native archaeological sites. They don't have quite the massive structures that are put on these islands more recently. But you can see on the left a photo of Thompson's Island showing some of the extreme erosion that's happened at the northern end of the island. And then also on the central and right image is the same location on Gallup's Island. It's an early 1900s fort structure. Over 2 years, this is just 2 years of erosion that's happening on the island. That this is all caused by climate change, but more importantly, from an archaeological perspective, it isn't the submersion of these sites under rising seas. It's actually the increased energy of the storms that it rapidly increases erosion that's dramatically impacting these sites. You can see the height of these structures are significantly above high tide. It's the erosion that's being caused by climate change that's causing these sites to quite literally fall off into the ocean. And if we don't document what's there before it's lost, then we don't have the ability to find that information, to learn those stories, to hear the stories of the past through the artifacts and the creations and the archaeological deposits that are here in Boston. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of leave with a parting thought with this final animation of Boston Harbor. Just to say that the Massachusett here have experienced sea level rise in Boston Harbor for quite literally thousands of years. Their lessons and insights are invaluable to our future and to our ability to understand and respond to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was absolutely fascinating. And let's now turn to Elizabeth for her perspective as a member of the Massachusett tribe at Ponkapog and her work with you. Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, I think you're on mute.
Apologies. I'm just gonna start my slideshow. And just wanted to say, like, we all live here. This is the place we all live. And one of the things that we assume is that we all experience this place in the same way. However, I would argue that different societies actually perceive the way that they exist in the world in fundamentally different ways. And so really, these perceptions profoundly affect how we interact with the environment. So I'd like to start with looking at the dominant Euro-American culture that we all currently live in. And this has, from my perspective, an overarching concept of separation. And I argue that although we intellectually recognize that we live on Earth and that we're dependent upon the Earth, we interact with our environment as if we're fundamentally separate from it. It's as if we see ourselves as a self-contained unit, independent from the larger environment. I describe this as living on. So examples of this is that we see ourselves as of prime importance and perceive our environment as providing resources for the exclusive use of humans. We treat these resources as if they're inexhaustible and as if our interactions with the Earth will not affect us adversely. I believe this concept of independence and autonomy also affects how we approach our understanding and examination of the world. So, for example, if we talk about how we actually examine the world in Euro-American culture, we tend to separate our inquiries into multiple different fields of inquiry. And that means we attempt to understand the world through multiple independent disciplines and even develop specializations within these disciplines. So if we think about philosophy, there are, which I think I spelled incorrectly, but there's also, there's the study of axiology, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, aesthetics, logic, and those can probably filter down into even more granular studies. If we think of science, we actually separate the physical sciences from the social sciences. So we are separating the study of the world from the study of ourselves. Again, this idea of separation, this idea that we are not part of the world, that we are somehow separate. And again, even within the physical sciences and the social sciences, just like philosophy, we break them down into further different disciplines or areas of inquiry. So in the physical sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, math. In the social sciences, which studies like human behavior, we have psychology, anthropology, archaeology. Thank you, Joe. Although some will argue that anthropology may be in the physical sciences, but that's something that we won't get into in this conversation. And then if we think about religion, even with religion, there's the study of the theory of religion and the practice of religion. So we are constantly pulling things apart to try to understand them. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is that the fact that we have the need to have what we call interdisciplinary studies, and the fact that they are unusual really highlights this, because the idea of bringing things together is seen as something different and a bit special. However, in Indigenous cultures, most Indigenous cultures often see ourselves as interwoven with the world. I call this living with. So we interact with the world through the lens of reciprocity. We do not see ourselves as the most important beings on the earth. And in fact, we have responsibility for how we interact with the world. We recognize that what we do has an effect on both ourselves and other things, and that we are responsible for those effects. So as opposed to the way that the Euro-American culture looks at it, the examination of our understanding of the world is interconnected with many fundamental questions. And I've just put in these questions that kind of make sense from a Euro-American point of view, but just to help people understand that all of these are inextricably interconnected, and we cannot consider one without considering all of the others. So we're looking at differences between the European culture of separation and individuality, and Indigenous cultures' idea of connection and reciprocity. So what does this have to do with climate change? So I would argue that the way that we live in the world, the way we perceive ourselves in the world, fundamentally affects how we interact with the world and what we see as important, and how we kind of make judgments about how to work, how to do things. So where are we now? So that, again, how we see ourselves in relation to the world takes on how we interact with each other and in the world. So where are we now, and how do we get there? So what I would argue is that the Euro-American concept of separation and individuality has taken us away from looking at how we interact with the world as a whole, and has really focused all of our attention on humanity, which I would say is relatively short-sighted, as we can see by the effects of climate change. So the examples of this concept of separation and individuality are the examples of that are primacy of human concerns and perspectives. And one of the ways we can look at that is through the concept of colonization. Most of us think about colonization as something that happened a long time ago and is over. But I would argue that colonization is something that is ongoing, and it is a fundamental aspect of Euro-American culture. So we are not just colonizing people in terms of that the European cultures or societies actually colonize much of the rest of the world, but we also are in the process of colonizing the earth. And what do I mean by that? The examples of that are the goals of resource extraction, the hoarding that happens in terms of particularly resources, the idea of capitalism, which not only forefronts humans, but also forefronts a subset of humans. So, and the other thing is also the discounting of other ways of knowing. So we have this sense, and this is something that I think is very prominent in science, of discounting different ways of knowing. So in terms of climate change, I think that one of the things that happens is, because we're talking about time, the idea of separation or interconnectedness really affects how we think about time. So if you are seeing humans as prime people, you know, the pinnacle of civilization, or the pinnacle of life, then you are going to perceive time in terms of how it relates to humans. So so that means that at most we're kind of thinking maybe a couple of generations in the future. However, if you see yourself as part of a larger whole that has responsibility to that whole, you are looking at time in terms of centuries at the least, and millennia in another way. As Joe was saying, if you think about how the climate has changed over the past 10,000 years and how it has been relatively unstable during that time, that we're always, that for indigenous societies or the Eastern woodland societies are constantly thinking about, okay, how are we interacting in the world? How is the world interacting with us? What does it mean when we're working to work with the world as opposed to seeing the world as a resource? So, and basically, what do we see as, you know, so what could be different? So I think that one of the things that we want to think about is that the idea of actually maybe some more interweaving within Euro-American society that helps us to see how things are better connected, that helps us to see ourselves not so much as separate, but actually as a fundamental, just one, not even fundamental, one part of a larger world. So one of the things that I think about is like, what are the things that get in the way? And so I would say a lot of this has to do with ways of thinking, and that there are areas that we have of perceived divergence between indigenous culture and the dominant culture. And again, I would say that those can be relatively, they may be false assumptions. So one of the things I want to think about is that when we're looking at the effects of climate change or how to address climate change, we tend to look at science and the scientific method. And the scientific method, as opposed to the thousands of years of reciprocal interactions that indigenous peoples have had. And so that, again, is what I was talking about in terms of with colonization, the discounting or not valuing other ways of knowing. And so the idea is that there's this, the idea that there's a difference or there's a divergence between the idea of experimentation versus the experience, when in fact, those things can probably come together in very useful ways. So in the scientific method, most people are aware, is like it talks about objective observation, evidence, experiment, then induction from the experiment, repetition, critical analysis. So it's this very iterative process, but really looks at the idea that there is objectivity in science. And I would argue that there is probably not objectivity in science, and that we actually really have relied on science in a way that may have closed other ways of knowing what is happening in the world and how we can address it. The things that I think I'd want to end with is the idea of intersections and integration. That there are ways that indigenous ways of knowing and European American ways of knowing or science can come together. So for instance, one of the things that Joe talks about was the formation of the harbor islands in terms of the drumlins. And one of the things that we did, we have one of our creation legends or stories is that there was a giant named Moshoop who dragged his feet. And he was a huge giant, obviously. He dragged his feet. And as dragging his feet, he basically formed the harbor islands. Well, we didn't know, well, that was a way of kind of talking about the glaciers that actually moved and actually formed the islands and formed much of the landscape as it is known now. The other thing that we've talked about for a very long time is the idea of other beings communicating with each other. And that's not just what we consider sentient animals, but also the idea of plants communicating with each other. And that was seen as something that was really kind of like maybe on the woo-woo side. But actually in a recent article, sometime within the last year, in the New York Times Magazine, a forest ecologist named Suzanne Semark actually looked at the communication between trees that happens via fungal networks that are underground. And so that the idea that trees are actually communicating with each other and reacting is no longer so far-fetched. One other thing is that within the Eastern Woodlands language, in some European languages, we look at there's differentiation made was based on male and female. In ours, it's animate and inanimate. But what we consider animate is very different than what the dominant culture would consider animate. So for example, we would say certain rocks would be animate. And one of the things that just recently came up in another New York Times article was a doctoral candidate at the University of Pennsylvania named Nakul Deshpande, and I'm probably totally messing up his or her name, but actually did an experiment that showed that even in areas, even by controlling for vibration, light, and other things, that grains of sand would move regardless of external forces. So I think that there's a lot that can happen in terms of the intersection and integration of both different ways of knowing that will help us in terms of moving forward in terms of how we react to climate change. So one of the things I want to end with is that one of the first things I learned in physics was when, that every action causes an equal and an opposite reaction. Now, that's sort of a very simplistic explanation of Newton's third law of physics. But basically what they're saying is that when objects A and B interact with each other, they exert forces upon each other. And that's one of the things that we say in indigenous cultures, is that whatever we do is affecting something else. In some of my talks in land acknowledgements, I say that everything we do, even every breath we take, has an effect on something else. So I would say that this is the truth, and that if you're wondering, just ask a physicist. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There was a lot of richness there, and we'll hear from Conor now, and then I have no doubt that you and he will have and Joe will have we'll have a discussion on your perceptions of what's going on. And okay, we have Conor's slide up, and without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Conor.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Conor Seyle, and today I am going to talk a little bit about this question of why is long-term thinking so hard? I'm going to give you an answer to that, maybe not the answer, but at least an answer. Next slide, please. But first, building off what Elizabeth said, I think it's useful to have a note on epistemology. Epistemology is this idea of when we say we know something, what does that mean? How do we know what we know? And there are different ways of answering that question. So if there are any cognitive scientists in the audience, and I wouldn't be surprised because Boston has some great ones, I think that what you'll find in my talk, what you'll hear is kind of the mainstream answer in psychology to this question. I don't think there's anything here that would be unusual in kind of an intro to social cognition class. But it's my answer as a psychologist. And I think that if you asked an anthropologist, you'd get a slightly different question. If you asked a sociologist, you'd get a different answer. If you asked a philosopher, you'd get a different answer, because there are different epistemologies here. And I think it's useful, building on Elizabeth's point, to kind of own the places that we're coming from. The dominant epistemology in psychology is based on a very traditional European empiricist scientific tradition. This is a portrait of Karl Popper, a very influential philosopher of science. And it's based on this idea that you can reduce complex questions into narrower and narrower sub-questions, which can then be answered by empirical data, preferably experiments. And then from that, you can build back up to an understanding of the system. Now, I tend to value this epistemology. It's the one I've chosen to work from. I like it. I find it useful, but I do need to acknowledge that it's limited. At the end of the day, we are all kind of blind men groping at the elephant, getting our own little slice of our understanding. And I want this to be seen as in conversation with these other ideas, not in competition. So having said that, what is my answer to this question of why are humans bad at long-term thinking? And actually, I have two answers to that, and it's tigers and chairs. And I will explain. Next slide, please. Okay, first, tigers. This is a video of a very famous tiger attack in northern India. Don't worry, all of the humans and the elephant come through okay. I don't think it works out as well for the tiger, but I am not sure. But the point I am making with this is, look at how incredibly sneaky this tiger is. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Predators are actually very sneaky. Prey animals are sneaky too. They don't want to be eaten. And if you cast your mind back to the time, even before the time that Joe was presenting, hundreds of thousands of years ago in the ancestral savanna, when the species that became Homo sapiens sapiens was evolving, we evolved in a context where attention was literally a life or death resource. If you were inattentive to your environment, if you failed to see a predator sneaking up on you, that was it. If you failed to see a prey animal that you could have eaten, that was not good. If you failed to spot nuts and berries that were important, likewise, these are things that had genuine life or death consequences. And that pressure shaped our cognitive system. They shaped the mechanisms that generate our way of interacting with the world. So that's one thing. Tigers. Next slide, please. Okay, chairs. Now, take a moment and look at these. Even if I didn't call these chairs, I think that you would look at these and you would say, aha, these are a bunch of chairs. There is some fundamental chairness to these different examples that lets you look at them and say, these are things for me to rest my behind on. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you actually really consider each of these different examples, it's difficult to identify a single characteristic that all of these have in common, other than a flat space for you to rest your bum. Some have arms, some don't. Some have legs, some don't. Some have backs, some don't. If you really look at each of these, there's a very big degree of variability. And if you didn't look at these and recognize them as chairs, if instead you had to interact with each of these as a sui generis item, as something that you had to sit there and think through deliberately and consciously, what is this intended to be? What can I use this for? That's an awful lot of attention to really sit there and consider, okay, look, it's got these elements. It might be comfortable if I sit on it. I'm going to choose to sit on it. That's attention that you could be using to keep an eye out for tigers, to keep an eye out for prey animals. So your cognitive system doesn't want you to do that. You don't have to. Instead, our brains have evolved the capacity to divide the world into chunks, into, in this case, we would call them schema, patterns where we say, okay, these are categories that we use to understand the world around us. And when I interact with something, I'm going to lump it into one of those categories and kind of get on with my life. This allows us to make decisions relatively quickly and to save our attention for these more potentially life or death issues of tigers and prey animals. Next slide, please. So in the technical language of psychology, this is referred to as the dual process theory of reasoning. It's a dual process because, of course, we don't only make decisions in that very quick, shorthanded way. Psychology would argue that humans tend to make decisions in two ways. The first approach, the most common approach, is called system one thinking or intuitive thinking or thinking fast, depending on who you're talking to. And this is a decision-making process based off of heuristics, mental shortcuts that allow us to very quickly make a decision and move on with our life, to save our attention for those things that we think of as critically important, as life or death, as immediate and pressing. System one thinking is mostly right. It generates answers that are mostly correct most of the time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have evolved. It wouldn't work. But the problem with doing that is that because it uses shortcuts, it generates specific predictable biases because it limits the amount of information we take in. It's preferencing speed over accuracy. Next slide, please. So in general, very often, I would argue, humans make decisions using this system one processing. There are some theories that would argue that it's actually the dominant way we interact with the world, that we make all decisions first using this, and then that type two, the other one I'll talk about in a second, comes in later. I would say that that's debated, but at minimum, it's the case that many decisions are made using this very quick, rapid processing. When we do this, it's especially likely when we're dealing with competing claims on our attention, when there's a lot going on and we don't have kind of the luxury of reflection, or when there's competing arguments, when there's a lot of information. So in the modern world, you can start to see how that is increasingly common. And also when we see issues as not immediate, that is, these are not crisis moments that require us to address them right now. And instead, when there are things where we can actually, just kind of, when they're not important, when they're things that aren't critical enough to trip us over into that, hey, we really need to think deeply about this. So thinking about this question of short-termism, both of these tend to bias towards immediacy. That is, we tend to pay more attention to stuff which is right in front of us, right kind of significant, things that are in crisis. And we tend to display a bias towards information that is immediately memorable and presented simply, and also connects to existing beliefs, which I'll talk about in a second. Most significantly, this tends to lead to a preference towards the existing status quo, because from a heuristic standpoint, your mind tends to say, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If this is the way that I've done things every day, I need to be presented with information that says that this is actually a crisis or something really significant to encourage me to break out of that mode of thinking. So this type 1 processing in general can reinforce a preference towards short-termism simply because it encourages us to pay more attention to things which are right in front of us or kind of more immediate crises, and to kind of restrict the amount of information we come in. But of course, that's not the only way we make decisions. And when we think about really important decisions, big life decisions, what job should I take? Should I get married? What is the future of the planet? These aren't decisions that we want to make in a kind of a shorthand fashion. And humans are perfectly capable of engaging in this type 2 process, thinking deliberatively, thinking slow, which is the kind of decision making that we're used to thinking about, weighing different kinds of information and kind of consciously and deliberately deciding what are we going to do. Unfortunately, it is not the case that that is free from biases either. And the reason for that gets back again to this evolutionary pressure. So next slide, please. So humans are social animals. The secret of our evolutionary success comes from our ability to work together as a group. There's an interesting argument, a lot of, especially in kind of like Western tradition, especially in American traditions, post-apocalyptic films tend to emphasize like the loners and the Mad Max and the people off by themselves. But the reality is apocalypses are not that rare in the historical record. We've, as a human society, lived through a number of them. And what we found in these apocalypses, whether it's the arrival of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere or massive climate change, is that the loners die. It's the societies that survive. It's the people who pull together in a group that actually survive these major crises. And that's because humans are ultimately social animals. It is in our nature as evolutionary kind of like creatures, we've adapted this collective strategy in our evolution. Now, what's interesting about that is that there are a couple of things that you find in every social animal. There are things that pretty much have to be true for individual organisms to survive in this collective model. Otherwise, you don't get this collective response. And in humans, we can drag these out into the light and we can name them and talk about them as core social motives, because humans have the ability to talk about these, to theorize them, and to point and to make art and culture around these. But what's interesting is that echoes of these are found in literally every social animal. Obviously, our close primates, chimpanzees, our close cousins, primates, chimpanzees, apes, these have these in very well-developed approaches, but it's also true in social animals like canids. Coyotes have echoes of all of these social motives. Schooling fish have behavior that look an awful lot like a lot of these social motives. And that's because evolutionarily, in order for an individual organism to have evolutionary success as a part of this collective, there are some things that just have to be true. Now, in humans, we would argue, we would define these core social motives as things like belonging. We want to belong to social groups. Understanding our environment. We want to have a model of the world that is more or less stable. Having agency, or the sense that we can move in the world. Feeling positive about ourselves and trusting others. Now, like I said, these are necessary for collective organisms to survive. You can argue, and people do, about to what extent these are evolved in the sense that they actually exist in our biology, or to what extent do these just show up across cultures because, like I said, they kind of need to be there or else you don't get collective action. And people do argue about that. But it is the case that versions of these are showing up pretty much every time you look at human societies, and even non-human animals that are collective animals as well. So here's the problem in the context of decision making. Next slide, please. We really want these things from our social environment. We want to find them. And what you find is that this desire creates a pressure. In general, it is easier for people to believe things that line up with these core social motives, and somewhat more difficult for us to believe things that don't. It's not impossible, we believe 7 impossible things before breakfast if we choose to, but it does mean that there is a pressure. And when we consider human society in the abstract, that pressure tends to aggregate up. Upton Sinclair, the journalist who wrote the book The Jungle, ran for governor of California in the 30s on the platform of ending poverty in California, arguing that California could fundamentally restructure its economy in ways that would be more fair. And he got beaten dramatically. He did not come in anywhere close to winning. And then he wrote a book about it. And his reflection on that loss was, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. That's one illustration of this idea. We tend to find it easier to accept things that are consistent with these core social motives and consistent with the things that we've already learned. And this can reinforce that bias towards a status quo, a kind of an acceptance of the way that things are, because it's part of our kind of general understanding. Next slide, please. So when you roll these two processes together, what I would argue is that this is what we see. Humans as individuals in the aggregate tend to make decisions quickly and on the basis of incomplete information, and to put much more weight on information that reinforces our pre-existing beliefs and negatives. Now, the good news about this is that these same biases that can bias us towards short-termism can bias us very quickly towards action when things get bad enough. In a lot of complex problems, you see this with Ebola in West Africa, you see this with climate change now. When things get bad enough that people actually realize, oh, these are really bad problems, behavior can change very rapidly, because these same biases can cause us to kind of snap to focus our attention on things that we see as crises. But this is the problem in the context of climate change. Things happen gradually and then suddenly, the way that Hemingway talks about going bankrupt. The problem with climate change is that many of the drivers of climate change have such a long lead time that by the time they become crises, we may as a society say, hey, these are really important, we have to fix them now. But it might be too late, or at least it might be too late without dramatic and significant changes in our environment or our culture that it's going to be a little bit difficult for us to do. So that would be my argument. Why are humans bad about short-term thinking? I would argue that evolution has shaped our cognitive environments, our cognitive processing, in ways that just make it that it's not easy for us to do. But that's kind of a depressing thing to leave you with. And I don't want to argue that we can't do it. Building off of Elizabeth's point, I want to come back to this question of what can we do about it? And the good news is there is something. And my answer to that would be institutions. Next slide, please. So up until now, I've been talking about us making decisions as individuals, but that's not actually how we make collective decisions. Instead, human societies make decisions through institutions, processes that say this is how we are going to come together as a group and make a collective decision. And those institutions can be designed to reinforce short-term thinking or longer-term thinking. And to Elizabeth's point about indigenous societies, this is something you see very directly in institutions. This is a very explicit discussion of this from a faith keeper for the Onondaga Nation, talking about the idea of a seventh generation philosophy, talking about how when the Council of Chiefs of the Onondaga meet, they deliberately and explicitly choose to think in the long term. Now, I would argue that the probable human psychology of everybody as individuals isn't dramatically different. There are certainly cultural differences that come in those type 2 processes, those social motives, what it means to how you see yourself in the world. That is shaped by culture. But the underlying kind of biology, the pressure towards heuristics and these kind of like social motives, those I would argue exist at the individual level. But in the institutions we choose to create, in how we reward people for the structural decisions that they are made, those are decisions that are made by us collectively. And we can choose to design those in ways which reinforce long-term thinking or short-termism. What I would argue is that if we don't consciously design them for the long term, in many cases, they are going to tend towards the short term, although not always. There are certainly cultures that have demonstrated that long-term thinking. So this is my final call to you. This is where I would like to leave it, is that you're all part of institutions. We're all part of institutions. And in kind of like in modern America, many of these institutions are formal governments, but not all of them. There's churches and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and kind of collective social groups. And what I would call for everybody to do is to think about how can we reward those institutions for long-term thinking. I've got to admit, I am not super optimistic about American politicians as individuals choosing to think in the long term. There's an old joke that the definition of long term in Washington, D.C. is until after the next election. But I am very confident that if politicians feel that they are rewarded for long-term thinking, their short-term thinking will lead them towards engaging in that long-term thinking. And so that would be the call as to what can we do about it? We can reward people who are in these institutions. We can shape them to incentivize this kind of longer term thinking. And that is possible. It has been done. Elizabeth showed us one way that it's been kind of instantiated. There are other examples as well, if we choose to, but it's got to be a conscious, deliberate choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Conor. That was, again, completely fascinating, 3 fascinating presentations. Thank you to all 3 of you. It's 12:04, so we're behind time. I'm going to change the rules of the game a little bit. I'm going to begin to throw the questions out to you from the chat and let the back and forth amongst you sort of spring from those. So if one of you answers the question, then either of the other 2 should feel free to jump in and kind of pile on or respond as you will. I do want to say just 1 or 2 quick things that I thought of while I was listening to you. One is that it's very hard to ignore the backdrop of the global summit in Glasgow that's going on right now. Different cultures, different institutions, different willingnesses to participate, but all of us collectively extremely far behind where we need to be. In terms of meeting the goals for bringing the temperature of the Earth down. And the other thing I thought of while you were speaking is my favorite E.O. Wilson quote, which is, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." And I think that that kind of speaks to what you were all 3 of you were talking about. So let me turn now to the chat. Thank you all. Please continue to put questions in the chat. We got a nice note from Mary Fisher at Brandeis, and she's you can probably take this offline, Conor, but she's wondering, can you recommend articles, readings Other authors than Kahneman that boil down humans' difficulty in seeing climate change as a threat. I'm going to let you think on that and answer it in a sec. And then Susan is saying she'd be interested to hear Elizabeth's and Conor's perspective on Joe's presentation, which I think is a great place to start. How do we understand the huge scope of change over thousands of years, which he depicted so compellingly? So I don't know which of you would like to begin. Maybe Elizabeth, because we just heard from Conor.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for and I'm going to pivot a little bit because I think this will kind of get to a little bit of the crux of the question. I'm wondering, in terms of Conor, what you were talking about is can we experience core social motives beyond the individual species? So in other words, is there a way to expand that idea in terms of the way, more in terms of indigeneity and indigenous values, so that we are seeing our social motives including things beyond ourselves?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of really interesting research in exactly that question, is where does our understanding of ourself come from? And that is something that varies significantly culturally. And what I would argue is that there's pretty good evidence that that concept of like who I am means different things in different cultures. And, one trivial version of this is if you just ask people to list like things that describe yourself. European cultures tend to list individual attributes, tall, basketball player or whatever. Folks from collectivistic cultures tend to list things that are relational. I'm a mother, I'm a father. They're kind of like part of this social connection. The challenge is changing that is a generational thing. I would argue. I think that it's exceptionally difficult for people's understandings of themselves and who they are to shift once they're set. There's a whole body of literature around what's called self-verification theory that basically shows that people really want to be reassured that their beliefs about who they are, their understanding of themselves, is not very variable. One of the things that makes some aspects of depression very hard to challenge is that if people genuinely have very negative views about themselves, for them to change that, for them to start seeing themselves positively, that might be something that they want to do, but that also undermines their entire story of themselves. And that's kind of a big thing. It's not something that we're super comfortable with. And so I think it's possible. I would suggest my answer to that, and of course, getting back to this competing epistemologies, I think there's probably a lot of different perspectives on this, but my answer to this would be that that if we wanted to shape more individualistic beliefs about the self to something that's more expansive, the way to do that would be to change behavior, and then kind of culture will follow after. So to shape institutions to reinforce people acting in ways that reinforce this kind of thinking in the longer term, or in a more interconnected and expansive way. And then I suspect that you'll start to see cultural shifts in terms of how people talk and how they think. I don't know that I think that it's very feasible to do it the other way around and to say, hey, we are going to change our culture first and then change our behavior after. But I think other people might disagree.
I want to jump in because this relates to another question, and that is from Fred Davis. And he's saying, if we know the future we want, and if we actually technically know how to get there, why can't we get there by telling the story over and over again? Like if can words frame our belief system and help us move toward change, I guess, if I had to paraphrase. And that would include not only individuals telling the story to them ourselves, but institutions would tell the story, museums, artists, if we're all telling a different story about what we see as our future, which is the same thing as like, can I use cognitive behavior therapy to get to work my way out of my depression if I tell myself a different story? But I think that's sort of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it goes to, I think one of the places where Conor and I agree is in terms of how one is perceiving oneself in terms of the world. And so and I am saying that in indigenous cultures, we perceive ourselves in relation to the world differently than the dominant culture does. So I guess, and so my argument is like, okay, in order to address this, we really have to kind of move the culture to a different place, because as long as we're like looking at, okay, what's most important for me, there's always going to be this tension in terms of what's important to me is harmful to somebody else or to the environment or whatever. So that there needs to be that shift. And I think the question that both of us are trying to get at, both Conor and I, is how do you make that shift? And so do I think storytelling alone can do that? No, because I think that honestly, it has to do with our core perceptions of self. And I don't know what would change that. I think that I honestly think some of that is like gradual in terms of like where we're saying we're placing our values. And as long as our values are around individual fulfillment and around and I think honestly capitalism is a huge driver of this, that we're going to have a very, very hard time shifting. It's a huge shift, but honestly, there was the shift from indigenous cultures to the dominant culture. I mean, everybody in indigenous cultures, there are none of us that are in, well, maybe some folks in Brazil that have not been exposed to Euro-American culture, but we are all assimilated into that, and we all need to kind of think about, okay, how can we move in a different direction? So in a way, it has to be a conscious choice.
So Joe, I want to make sure you get a word in here. So you presented a timeline in which 1630 to now was like one tiny fraction, and the rest of it was pre-European. What evidence, if any, is there of kind of like attempts to adapt over time, or like why did this harmony exist for as long as it did, and then suddenly, boom, we shifted to what Elizabeth is now calling the dominant culture?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, and I want to, before I answer that completely, I want to go back to the storytelling idea real fast, because the way we tell stories and what stories we tell is also inherently based on our culture and our epistemology. So, for example, if a Massachusetts person was giving the first 12,000 years of Massachusetts history presentation instead of me, I think the actual fundamental story would be different. What was told, how it was told, whether or not it was discussing types of arrowheads and spear points being used may not have been a relevant thing to the Massachusetts person telling that story. So I think that our stories and the way that we tell stories are inherently based on the whatever thing we bring to the table. Like, I'm an archaeologist who grew up in Maine, so that's going to feed into the fact that I'm not a native person and I study the stuff that people leave behind. But that's part of the issue with Amy, with your question, is that archaeology is still fundamentally essentially writing a story, telling a story from extremely limited pieces of data. And when we look at the things that come out of the ground, we see stone tools, we see pottery. We might be lucky enough to see kind of the echoes of structures from the small holes that posts went into, or a fire pit, or clams from food, or deer bones, to try to be able to say, these clams and these deer bones show a Massachusett tribe working to evolve with the coastline and changing ecology and landscape. It's a little bit harder to do, but I think that the main issue isn't hard to do because it's impossible to do. It's hard to do because an archaeologist will come to the table saying, what can I tell the story about clamshells, animal bones, pottery, and stone tools? But if you had a native archaeologist come to the story, come to do that same analysis, there could be a lot more opportunities for figuring out ways that a non-archaeologist would be able to interpret that same story in a different way. And so that's why collaborative archaeology is really such an important part of what we're trying to do in Boston and looking ahead. Is archaeology is a tool, and it's a fundamentally limited tool. But to be able to get to that perspective of how people have adapted and adopted with the changing landscape, that needs that addition of the native perspective brought into it, because I'm not going to be able to make the logical leap that I'm inherently limited to with the tools I have as an archaeologist, as a scientific archaeologist going into it. And that's where the native story really can kind of supplement and add to that story, and hopefully both be able to gain from each other. That's not to say that there isn't evidence of adaptation to climate change and to changes of the landscape. But it's not quite so inherently built into the process. You have to really look, you have to ask the right questions, and you have to design the surveys to answer those questions. But it may not have been the questions that have been answered asked for the past 30 years. And so we're kind of behind in the analysis, frankly.
Right, and it's also inherently a physical science. So I as you're talking, I'm thinking about Dr. Carolyn Crockett and her book, People Before Highways, and how you can tell the story from the federal government, the Eisenhower administration funding highways and highway expansion, or you can tell the story from the perspective of people who lived through dislocation in Boston and their collective memory. And, you just end up with a completely different type of narrative and a different narrative period. How is this all, well, actually, I will stop asking my questions. I'll go back to the audience here to be fair. Peter is asking, why do many people not see the Earth as a living planet that we are an integral part of and must be protected? Why don't people get that? It's the source of our life and existence. Why is this other thing that all of you talked about?
Well, I really do. I don't think that all of us do. I mean, we don't all see. I mean, that's the dominant culture.
Okay, fair enough.
Perspective. So, and I would argue that, I mean, I think one of the ways when I talked about where Conor and I kind of came together, and I'm going to talk about where we may become apart, is that I think a lot of that is culturally based. Is that basically, I mean, what Conor's talking about is the idea that, how biology and evolution have shaped the way that we interact with our environment. But culture has an incredibly powerful effect on that. And that how, again, like how we're kind of interacting with the world makes a difference. So in Indigenous societies, if you are constantly thinking about not seeing yourself as separate, that you're seeing yourself as only one part, and in many ways an insignificant part of a whole, then you are more in tune with what is happening in your environment on a micro level that most of us are not cognizant of, because we're not used to looking at it that way. So if we see a difference between, as like what Joe was saying earlier, when he was talking about oyster beds or whatever, we'll notice, if you're very in tune with the environment, you're going to notice these subtle changes much earlier. And I think one of the things is that we have, as the culture the predominant culture on the earth today is based on Euro-American culture, has an idea of individualism, has this sense of capitalism, and it's really kind of separating us from being able to do that, because those are sort of what our values have kind of evolved to be, based on the culture that we're living in. And I don't know how to get back to that other than kind of again, some of it is the storytelling, but really kind of thinking about, or I don't even think it's thinking. I think it's a way of being. It's the way that I connect. I feel that I connect with the earth has nothing to do with what's going on in my head. I mean, Conor would probably argue that, but I would say that it really is very visceral, and so that really kind of. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that so much of this is bound in culture and value, and then the biology kind of comes in, but how we manifest that biology is dependent upon culture.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting. I feel like we agree in substance and maybe disagree in kind, because I don't disagree with anything that you said there. I do think that culture is really significant about this. But to this question of why do we not realize this? With all the caveats that Elizabeth laid out, that a lot of people really do think in that way. I would argue that people are just not really good at that big picture thinking, and this is not just about kind of this specific question. So Blaise Pascal, right? The famous Pascal's wager, that comes from a collection of his writing called Thoughts. And one of the themes of that was, he was coming at it from a European Christian perspective, but one of the themes of that writing is the only thing all humans should be thinking about at all times is what happens after death, because it's the only important question. If you're coming in, again, coming at it from that very Christian perspective, basically, if the Christian thought is right, then this is the only important question, is how are you going to spend your afterlife? And why are we as humans not at any point not thinking about that question as the ultimate thing that should overhang all of us? I'm putting that out there not to start a theological debate, but to point out that there's lots of these big questions that you can make a pretty strong argument that we should all be obsessed with every day. But the reality is, you gotta make breakfast, you gotta pay rent. The day-to-day experience of living does not reinforce us thinking in these very large, big picture ways. And unfortunately, that can create a garden path where we make a bunch of very small decisions that aggregate towards very big outcomes that we didn't intend. And this connects back to this question about storytelling. I've indicated that I'm not super optimistic about the ability of storytelling to fundamentally change our thinking. But what it can do is reinforce salience. There's lots of people out here in the world of a variety of different perspectives that do want to be thinking or acting in the long term, but may not be thinking about that every day. My wife laughs at me well, she doesn't laugh at me, she yells at me, because I'm not as good at recycling as I should be. It's very easy for me to just chuck something into the trash can because I'm not thinking about it. I'm thinking about, am I preparing for this talk or whatever? And in that specific moment, that action doesn't line up with my intent because my intent is not salient to me. And one of the values of storytelling is that it just increases our exposure on a day-to-day basis to reminders that we can be thinking in the long term, and kind of can help us align our short-term behavior with these longer-term thinking. Now, that's not, I don't know that that's going to fundamentally change people who are not already in alignment with that. But like I said, I think that when you change the aggregate of behavior, then culture change happens after that.
Joe?
Yeah, I was going to add to that, some of my personal experience going to classrooms. I feel like young people, to talk about kind of how this can start to shift, I feel like young people have really been heavily exposed to the problems of climate change. And I really feel like young people today are going to be the people that really help save us, frankly. What's left to do, what can be done. But there's also this disconnect between the exposure of young people, especially in urban environments, with the things that we're talking about, with the land, with the ecology, with things. So like, I'll go to a classroom and I could have a really long conversation with folks about climate change, and really intelligent conversation with young people about climate change. And I can bring out some clamshells and people don't know what they are. And I feel like that's the issue, is that there's still some of this disconnect between the physical landscape and the physical outdoors, because you can, like, I could very easily, as a Boston resident, spend most of my time on paved surfaces indoors and in a vehicle, and not interact with the shoreline, and not interact with the ocean, and not interact with the Neponset River down the street from me, and not interact with the parks if I chose. I don't need those things to survive. I personally do emotionally, but not everybody does. And I think that one of the ways that we can kind of shape the future, especially through young people, is to make sure that young people are experiencing and interacting with the outdoor environment in a way that at least allows this kind of literacy effect of what is outside, what is the ocean, what are the plants, what are the animals, that otherwise it's actually hard to get interaction with wild animals in Boston, for example, without going to the zoo. And so that to me is, I think, where we can change some of that narrative to make it so that it is personal, it is kind of your story. I talk to people when I'm doing digs in say Roxbury, where it's today a predominantly majority minority community. But if I go back to the 1700s to do archaeology, if I'm doing archaeology in the 1700s, it's a very different community story that I'm telling through that archaeology. However, if we have folks from the Roxbury community doing that dig, that maybe don't directly relate to the narrative of that time period. However, by participating in that dig, it becomes their story as well. And I think that's how we can have this this ownership of the not true ownerships, but the directly experiencing these issues by people by exposure, essentially, and to increase outdoor education, to increase the ability of people to see and interact with these things. And I think that's going to do quite a bit of good, because frankly, I think the climate change narrative is really well appreciated by young people throughout everywhere, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well said. And it reminds me of the last GRCx program we had, where we had Karen from the Emerald Necklace Conservancy and Brenda from the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, and Garrett Nelson from the Leventhal Map Center. And they talked about that kind of teaching and providing those kinds of experiences that are real and hands-on, but to teach, to not only expose people to real nature and real things, maps, physical things, but also to teach love, to teach empathy, because it's more than just knowing, you also have to really care. And I think that brings me back around to what we're trying to do at the Green Ribbon Commission with the Cultural Institutions Working Group overall, which is to encourage institutions, and thank you all, whoever's on this, watching this webinar from an institution, especially a cultural institution today, to really think about how to participate in this conversation, because you can be so helpful to young people, but also everybody else as well, in like getting you off the screen, like out of your car, whatever it is. We have just 2 more minutes. I don't know if anyone wants to get in a last word. I can ask my big question again. Why aren't we all out in the streets? One sentence answer. We've got the bus is coming. As Mindy Lubber from series always says, if you saw your child out in the street with a bus barreling down upon the child, you would leap into action and snatch up the child and move them out of harm's way. Why aren't we doing that? I'm going to pick on you. All right, I'll start with you, Conor.
I think the problem is that it's very difficult for us as individuals to do anything to change these big things. We have to do it as a society or as a global society. And the reality is, as a global society, we don't have very good mechanisms for collective decision making.
All right. I'm going to stop you. That was good. Okay. Let's see, Joe.
So hopefully someone else is already working on
it. Okay, and Elizabeth.
I think we're just disconnected from the world. We just don't believe that it'll affect us. I mean, in deep down, it's like, this is not gonna.
We're on, not with.
Yep.
Well, that was a slightly pessimistic note to end on for what was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you to all 3 of you very much. I hope we'll get a chance to talk some more offline after this. And there's been lots of comments about how this discussion needs to go farther and wider, and requests for resources. So I think you all really have struck an important note here. I will invite everyone to come on November 17th to our next GRCx program, which is on the circular economy opportunity, deepening decarbonization through sustainability of all value chains. And until then, thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk again soon.